The German shepherd's barking tore through the frozen silence of Silver Creek Cemetery. Retired Chief Robert Hayes stood before his son's grave, his breath forming pale ghosts in the bitter Montana cold. 3 weeks. 3 endless weeks of Ranger's relentless barking at this same patch of earth. Neighbors thought grief had driven him mad. His own department stopped answering his calls. But tonight, as snow piled higher and the wind carried the dog's desperate cries, Robert saw it. The ground had risen nearly half a foot. Impossible. Graves don't move. Yet here it was, Ethan's resting place, bulging upward like something beneath was trying to breathe. And deep down, Robert knew his son's story wasn't over. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. The storm had rolled over Silver Creek like a white tide, swallowing every road, every fence post, every memory. Snow fell in heavy curtains that blurred the world into shades of gray. Robert Hayes stood alone on the frozen hill of Pinecrest Cemetery, his gloved hands trembling as the wind whipped through his thick gray coat. At 58, Robert carried the kind of weariness that no sleep could cure. His face was sharp, framed by silver-flecked stubble, eyes the color of cold river stone. Years of service as the town's police chief had carved quiet discipline into him, but loss had hollowed it out. Before him lay a mound of white, his son's grave. Ethan Hayes, 17, dead for 2 years, and still the earth would not settle. Beside him, Ranger barked into the blizzard, each sound cutting through the silence like an alarm in a church. The 7-year-old German shepherd was massive and built with the taut strength of a soldier. Black and tan fur dusted with snow, tail rigid, amber eyes locked on the grave. He had once served in Robert's K-9 unit before failing the final test for being too sensitive. Ethan had loved him instantly, insisting the dog could feel what people couldn't. Robert hadn't believed it then. Now, he wasn't so sure. For 3 weeks, the pattern had been the same. Every morning at dawn, Robert trudged up this hill through snow that came to his knees. Every morning, Ranger barked and pawed at the frozen soil covering Ethan's coffin. The ground had risen, first by an inch, then 3, then nearly half a foot. Graves didn't grow. They sank. He had measured it twice, hoping he was wrong. He wasn't. He knelt, brushing the snow away from the marble headstone, tracing the letters with bare fingers until his skin burned. Ethan Robert Hayes, beloved son, 2006-2023. The numbers felt unreal, as if they belonged to someone else's life. The boy in his mind still laughed, still rode his dirt bike down the street shouting over the wind, still took photographs of sunrise through frost-bitten windows. Ethan had been tall for his age, lean and pale, with brown hair that never obeyed a comb and a smile that disarmed even his father's sternest moods. He'd inherited his mother's kindness and Robert's stubborn streak. A gust cut across the hill, slapping snow into Robert's face. He didn't move. His heart ached in that dull, familiar rhythm. Grief had become a second heartbeat. He whispered to the grave, his breath visible in the cold. "What are you trying to tell me, kid?" Ranger answered with a bark so fierce it startled him. The dog began digging, claws raking through crusted snow. Robert pulled him back. "Easy, boy." But the shepherd strained against the leash, chest heaving, eyes wide with a wild kind of certainty. Robert looked around the cemetery. Nothing moved but the snow. The place was deserted, just the rows of stone and a single lamppost flickering weakly near the gate. He could almost hear his old colleagues in town laughing at him. They already whispered that he'd lost his mind since Ethan's death. Maybe they were right. But he couldn't ignore what he saw. The grave was rising. He remembered the funeral. The mayor had stood there in his thick black coat, mouthing polite sorrow. Robert hadn't listened. All he remembered was lowering the coffin himself, refusing help. Ethan had died in what the police called a lab accident, a chemical explosion during a school project. But even then, something in Robert had recoiled from the official report. His instincts, the same ones that had caught murderers and liars for decades, had screamed otherwise. Snow lashed his face again. He pulled his collar higher and started back toward the truck parked by the cemetery gates. Ranger refused to move, planted firmly beside the grave. "Come on," Robert said, but the dog only whimpered, nose pressed to the soil as if trying to smell through time. Robert crouched down, hand resting on the dog's back. "You miss him too, huh?" The animal leaned into his touch. For a long moment, Robert simply knelt there, listening. To the wind, to the heartbeat of silence, to the whisper of something that might have been his own guilt. He thought about the last time he'd seen Ethan alive. The boy had been pacing in the kitchen, backpack slung over one shoulder, camera hanging from his neck. He'd said something about needing to prove a point, about people not being who they seemed. Robert, exhausted from another 12-hour shift, had dismissed it as teenage defiance. By nightfall, Ethan was gone. Now, as Ranger's breath steamed in the freezing air, Robert felt that same old failure like a blade against his ribs. He'd failed to listen to his son once. He couldn't do it again. He leaned closer to the grave, pressing his palm flat against the snow-covered mound. Beneath the cold crust, the earth pulsed faintly, soft, hollow, not solid as it should be. He froze. Was that movement? A shift, almost imperceptible, but there. Ranger stiffened, hackles rising. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Robert yanked his hand back, pulse hammering. "Easy, boy." But the shepherd's gaze didn't leave the ground. Snowflakes fell thicker now, swirling around them in ghostly spirals. Somewhere far off, a church bell tolled 6 times. He stood, brushing the frost from his gloves, trying to steady his breath. He would come back tomorrow with tools, maybe a ground sensor from the department's old rescue unit. He'd prove to himself that it was nothing. Frozen soil, trapped air, the imagination of a grieving man. Yet as he turned to leave, Ranger gave one last sharp bark that echoed through the cemetery and into the valley below. Robert stopped. Something inside him, something that had been buried with Ethan, stirred again. He looked back at the grave, snow settling over it like dust over a secret. "All right," he murmured. "Tomorrow we dig." The wind carried his words away, but Ranger seemed to understand. The dog's ears twitched, his tail lowered, his body still tense as if bracing for what lay beneath. In the distance, lightning flickered behind the storm clouds, silent, brief, like a flash of memory. The ground at Ethan's grave trembled once, faint but real. Robert felt it through his boots. He turned toward Ranger, but the dog was already staring down, teeth bared at the earth that refused to sleep. Morning crept into Silver Creek beneath a heavy sky of iron and snow. Robert Hayes sat in the small kitchen of his cabin, staring at the notebook spread open on the table. The pages smelled faintly of smoke and winter dust. On one page, written in his son's familiar hand, the words were underlined twice. "If something happens, trust Ranger." The ink had bled slightly, as though Ethan had written it in haste or fear. The light through the frosted window painted Robert's face in cold hues. He looked older than his 58 years, skin drawn tight along the jaw, silver stubble unshaven, eyes gray and restless. Grief had carved him hollow. The silence pressed against his thoughts like ice. At his feet, Ranger lay motionless but alert, his thick fur rising and falling with each breath. The dog's amber eyes never left the door. Robert flipped through the notebook again, his fingers brushing over rough sketches of the old cemetery, coordinates and fragments of half-finished sentences. Ethan had been meticulous about his notes, precise when it came to light, angles, and time. The boy had loved photography since he could walk. There were even smudges of darkroom chemical stains near the edges, reminders of long nights they'd once spent developing photos together. Robert stood, pushed the chair back, and walked to the window. The snow outside lay smooth and unbroken, stretching across the valley toward the cemetery hill where Ethan rested. In that white silence, the events of last night replayed in his mind, the tremor beneath the grave, the way Ranger had growled at the earth as though it breathed. He could no longer dismiss it as imagination. Something was happening beneath the frozen ground, and he needed to know what. He drove into town as the morning fog lifted. Silver Creek in winter was nearly deserted. Storefronts were shuttered, the streets empty except for the occasional figure bundled in thick coats. The bell above the diner door jingled weakly as he entered. The warmth hit him first, followed by the smell of coffee and frying eggs. Maggie Porter was behind the counter, short and round, her graying red curls tied back under a knitted cap. Maggie had known the Hayes family for decades. Her voice carried that brisk tenderness, born from both loss and endurance. She poured him coffee without asking and gave him a look that hovered between concern and reproach. Robert simply nodded his thanks. The cup trembled slightly in his hand. He stayed silent, letting the warmth seep into his bones. Conversations murmured at nearby tables. farmers, a mail driver, the same small-town rhythm that had continued even after Ethan's death. The ordinariness of it all felt almost cruel. When he finally left the diner, snow had started again. He stopped by the small brick building of the Silver Creek Historical Society. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and radiator heat. After a brief exchange with the elderly clerk, Robert left with a bundle of photocopied records. Back home, he spread them across the table. The cemetery, according to the archives, sat directly atop the Marrow Copper Mine, abandoned more than a century ago after a catastrophic collapse. Yet the blueprints showed something odd. Several shafts had been reinforced in the 1950s for municipal use. No explanation. Robert stared at the lines on the map until his eyes blurred. Beneath Ethan's resting place, a black tunnel ran like a vein through the frozen soil. Ranger's head lifted suddenly, ears pricking toward the window. The dog let out a low sound, halfway between a growl and a whine. Robert turned and saw a truck pulling into his drive. Tom Weaver climbed out, snow dusting his coat. He was lean and bony, a man built from wind and work, his skin weathered, one eye filmed white from an accident years ago. Tom had tended the cemetery for decades, rarely speaking to anyone unless he had to. Robert opened the door before the man could knock. Tom's breath rose in pale clouds. He hesitated before speaking. "You've been up there again." Robert didn't answer, only waited. Tom's gaze flicked past him toward the direction of the cemetery, invisible behind the snow. "The ground's not right," he said finally, voice low. "It's been shifting. I hear it at night sometimes, like metal on stone." He rubbed a gloved hand over his face. "Whatever's under there, it's better left alone." He turned and walked back to his truck, leaving deep footprints in the snow. Robert watched until the sound of the engine faded into the wind. He returned inside and unfolded the map once more. The lines of the tunnels seemed to twist under his fingers, forming something alive. Ethan must have found this. The boy had always been curious, restless, unwilling to look away when he saw something wrong. He'd likely gone exploring the tunnels, camera in hand. That thought hit Robert like a fist. His son hadn't died by accident. He'd been silenced. The wind howled against the cabin windows. Dusk settled like bruised light across the snow. Robert stood at the window again, feeling the pressure in his chest, the mixture of fear and certainty that had driven every good cop he'd ever known, the kind of instinct you didn't argue with. He looked down at Ranger. The dog was already standing, hackles raised, staring toward the hills. His breath fogged the glass with each exhale. Robert followed his gaze and saw faint glimmers through the storm. Small lights flickering near the cemetery slope. They moved deliberately, disappearing and reappearing in the snow. He felt the hairs rise along his neck. No one should be up there this late. Robert reached for his coat and the pistol locked in its holster. Ranger trotted to the door, tail low but ready, the same focused stillness he'd once shown during search operations. Outside, the wind cut through everything, but the light still pulsed on the hill, a slow and steady rhythm. As Robert and Ranger stepped into the storm, the snow swallowed their footprints almost immediately. The world turned silent, but for the wind and the steady crunch of boots. Somewhere ahead, the cemetery waited, its white mounds gleaming faintly like bones beneath the moon. And under all that frozen earth, something stirred. The storm had not eased, it had only changed its shape. By nightfall, the snow fell in thick, windless sheets, soft enough to muffle sound but heavy enough to bury a man's resolve. Robert Hayes trudged up the slope toward Pinecrest Cemetery, his boots sinking deep with every step. Ranger moved beside him, low and silent, a dark shadow against the white expanse. The beam of Robert's flashlight cut a narrow path through the swirling snow, glinting off the iron gate ahead. The world seemed drained of color. Only black, white, and the faint gold flicker of light in the distance where the cemetery waited. He had followed the lights for nearly a mile. They appeared and vanished, flickering in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be random. As he reached the gate, he saw footprints half buried in the snow. 2 sets, maybe 3, leading toward the northern row of graves. They were fresh. His hand went instinctively to the pistol beneath his coat. The cemetery was a landscape of ghosts, Frost clung to every headstone, and the trees bowed under the weight of snow. The air smelled faintly metallic, like cold iron. Robert's breath came out in slow clouds as he moved between the graves, Ranger close behind. The dog's ears were sharp, tail stiff, every muscle alert. Somewhere ahead, a faint creak of metal echoed, a gate hinge or something heavier. Near Ethan's grave, the ground had changed again. The mound was higher now, the edges cracked open where the frost couldn't keep up. Robert's flashlight caught a faint shimmer beneath the snow, like a thin sheet of ice that had been disturbed from below. He knelt, brushing the snow aside. The soil beneath was no longer frozen solid. It felt soft, almost warm. His pulse quickened. Then he heard it. Movement, faint but unmistakable. A sound of shifting stone. Ranger growled low, fur bristling. Robert froze. The sound came again, from behind the tall memorials near the far edge of the cemetery. He killed his flashlight and waited. Two silhouettes emerged from the darkness, the glow of handheld lamps swaying with their steps. The first man was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy work jacket and a knit cap. Even through the snow, Robert recognized him. Tom Weaver, the caretaker. The other man was unfamiliar, younger, perhaps in his 30s, moving with the cautious precision of someone who didn't belong there. His face was pale against the night, clean-shaven, sharp-featured, eyes darting nervously. He carried a small metal case and kept glancing over his shoulder. Robert stayed low, hidden behind a line of gravestones. Ranger pressed against his leg, silent. The men stopped near Ethan's grave. Tom knelt, brushing the snow away from the disturbed earth. "It's coming up faster now," the younger man said, his voice barely audible through the wind. "They'll notice soon." "They already have," Tom muttered. His tone carried resignation, not fear. "We finished tonight." The younger man set down the metal case, opened it, and removed what looked like a small detector, sleek, military-grade, with a digital screen that pulsed faint green. He scanned the soil slowly, the device emitting faint beeps. "Signal's strong. It's right below." Robert felt his stomach twist. What were they looking for? Tom stood and turned, his face lined with exhaustion. "You shouldn't have come back here," he said suddenly, his voice carrying through the stillness. It took Robert a moment to realize the words were not directed at the younger man. They were aimed into the dark, at him. Robert rose from behind the graves, gun drawn. "Step away from the ground, Tom." The younger man flinched, hands instinctively lifting. Ranger growled beside Robert, snow scattering beneath his paws. Tom didn't move. "You don't understand what you're standing on," he said quietly. "That mine shouldn't exist anymore." "Then explain it to me." Tom hesitated, eyes flicking to the younger man, who shifted uncomfortably. "You remember the collapse in 1903? That wasn't an accident. They sealed the tunnels because something else was buried down there before the miners ever came." His voice shook now, breath clouding in the cold. "The town's been keeping it quiet for over a century." The younger man spoke up, his voice crisp, educated. "I'm Dr. Lewis Crane, geologist with the State Survey. I was sent to inspect the sinkholes last spring." He swallowed hard. "Only I wasn't told there was a body buried over one." Robert's pulse hammered. "You're saying my son's grave is above the main shaft," Crane finished, eyes flicking to his device. "Something down there is emitting heat, not chemical, not electrical, organic." A sharp sound cracked the air, the faint metallic groan of shifting earth. The ground trembled beneath their boots. Ranger barked once, loud and sharp. The snow around Ethan's grave caved inward, a small circle sinking as if something beneath had collapsed. Crane stumbled back. "We need to move!" But Robert couldn't. His feet felt frozen to the ground. He could see Ethan's name glinting on the stone, half buried now in fresh snow. Tom lunged forward, grabbing Robert's arm. "Get back!" The soil split open with a deep sucking sound, a dark hole yawning where the grave had been. Warm air poured out, heavy with the scent of copper and earth. Ranger barked furiously, pulling at the leash. For a moment, Robert thought he heard something rise from below, a faint echo that could have been wind or a voice. Then it stopped. Silence returned, heavier than before. Crane's detector flickered wildly, its screen flashing red. "The readings just spiked," he whispered. "Whatever's down there isn't dead." Robert turned slowly toward him, the world spinning in a haze of snow and dread. You're telling me my son's grave is, what, alive? No one answered. Ranger stepped toward the edge of the pit, growling into the darkness. The hole exhaled faint steam, like breath in the winter air. For an instant, Robert swore he saw movement, a shimmer deep within, far below the reach of light. He took a step closer, but Tom's voice stopped him. "Don't look down there, Robert. Once you see it, you won't come back the same." The wind rose again, carrying snow like ash across the graves. The hole in the ground pulsed once, faintly, as if something deep beneath the frozen earth had begun to wake. The storm that night felt endless, an old, weary kind of storm that didn't rage so much as whisper, slow and steady, as if nature itself were holding its breath. The entire cemetery of Pinecrest lay beneath a blanket of snow so thick it muffled even memory. The only movement came from the orange glow of Robert Hayes's flashlight and the lean, tense shadow of his German Shepherd Ranger, who padded silently beside him. Robert's breath came in ragged plumes. His knees ached from the cold, but something stronger than pain kept him moving, the instinct that what waited under the frozen earth was no longer just grief. The grave that once belonged to his son was now a gaping wound in the snow. Steam rose from it, faint but constant, carrying a strange metallic tang that stung his nostrils. He had seen every kind of death in 30 years of service, but never this, the living warmth of a grave. Dr. Lewis Crane crouched near the edge, his gloved fingers trembling over the device in his hand. He was 35, tall and narrow-shouldered, his pale face ghost-like under the flashlight beam. His reputation as a meticulous geologist preceded him, a man more comfortable with data than people. Yet tonight, even science had abandoned him. The detector's screen glowed red, pulsating erratically. "It's alive," he said under his breath, though he hadn't meant to speak aloud. Tom Weaver, the cemetery caretaker, stood several feet away, half hidden behind a leaning angel statue. His gray hair was matted with snow, his heavy coat stained with years of work. A man of 70, with one cloudy eye and another sharp as flint, Tom had been digging graves in Pinecrest for decades, burying both strangers and secrets. "That mine was sealed before I was born," he rasped. "They said it was gas leaks. They lied." Robert straightened, his coat heavy with ice. His face, lined, weathered, marked by sleepless nights, was half lit by the flashlight. "Who's they?" Tom hesitated. The wind seemed to answer first, a hollow moan sweeping through the graveyard. "The men who built this town, the ones who used the mine long after it closed. People went missing, vagrants, drifters, sometimes children. They said it was the cold, but it wasn't." Robert's jaw tightened. Beneath the years of sorrow, an old fire flickered, the one that had once made him a relentless cop. He crouched, brushing snow from the edge of the grave. The soil was slick, soft, almost breathing. "Ethan must have found something," he murmured. "That's why they killed him." Ranger let out a sudden bark, sharp, cutting through the wind. The dog's gaze was fixed on the far end of the cemetery, where headlights glowed faintly through the storm. 3 vehicles rolled slowly up the hill, engines growling like beasts in the dark. Tom's face went ashen. "God help us," he whispered. "They came back." The cars stopped near the gate. Figures spilled. Out! Men in dark coats, rifles slung across their shoulders, flashlights sweeping in perfect synchronization, military precision. They moved with purpose. Robert's hand went to his weapon automatically. Ranger pressed close to his leg, muscles taut. Dr. Crane rose to his feet, panic flickering across his features. "They're armed," he hissed. "We need to leave." Too late. A familiar voice cut through the storm. "Robert Hayes," it said, low and cold. "Still chasing ghosts?" The world seemed to still. From the lead car stepped Sheriff Alan Brooks, his heavy coat unbuttoned despite the cold. He was in his early 50s, still broad-shouldered, but his face had hardened into something brittle and merciless. Years ago, Robert had trusted that face, the same man who'd stood beside him through shootouts and funerals. But now, the eyes that met his were hollow. Robert's grip on his pistol tightened. "Alan," Brooks smirked faintly. "You were supposed to stop coming here. You're making this harder than it has to be." Behind him, one of the armed men raised a flashlight toward the grave. The light fell on the steam, the disturbed soil, the heat pulsing beneath. "It's open," he called out. Brooks's expression shifted, anger mixed with panic. "Then we move now. Burn it. No evidence." The words didn't make sense until Robert saw the jerry cans in their hands. Gasoline. They were going to destroy the site. "Stop!" Robert shouted, stepping forward, gun raised. The snow exploded in his flashlight's beam as the first shot was fired. He dove behind a headstone, the bullet shattering marble beside his head. Ranger barked furiously, his deep, chesty growls echoing across the graves. Tom took cover behind the angel statue, cursing under his breath. Dr. Crane hit the ground, clutching his equipment to his chest. More gunfire followed, short, controlled bursts. Robert returned fire, taking down one man who crumpled into the snow with a choked cry. Then, everything stopped. Brooks stepped forward, lowering his weapon. "You're outnumbered," he called, "and you still don't understand. Ethan died because he wouldn't listen." The words froze Robert in place. His heart thudded against his ribs, disbelief clawing at him. "You killed him?" Brooks didn't blink. "He filmed a transfer at the old mine entrance 2 years ago, said he'd expose it. I warned him once. He thought the law still meant something." A silence followed, thick, suffocating. The snow whispered around them like falling ash. Robert's voice dropped to a hoarse growl. "You murdered my son." Brooks tilted his head, a cruel smile cutting across his weathered face. "I kept this town safe. You of all people should understand what sacrifice looks like." The ground trembled again, a low, deep vibration that made the loose soil shift beneath their feet. The grave widened, cracking open like the earth itself. Recoiled from the truth. A gust of hot air burst upward, curling into the storm. Ranger barked once, sharp and terrified. Before anyone could react, another gunshot split the air, not from Robert or Brooks. Brooks staggered, shock flashing in his eyes as blood bloomed across his coat. He turned slowly, confusion twisting his features. At the edge of the headlight stood Mary Hayes, Robert's mother, 80 years old, wrapped in a long wool coat, her gray hair whipping in the wind. The revolver in her hand smoked faintly, steady despite the tremor in her body. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Brooks collapsed sideways into the snow, crimson spreading like ink through white linen. The armed men faltered, uncertain. Then, one by one, they backed away into the storm, leaving their leader where he fell. Silence reclaimed the cemetery. Only the sound of wind remained, carrying the faint hiss of steam from the grave. Robert sank to his knees beside the pit. His mother approached slowly, her breath ragged, the revolver hanging loose at her side. "I followed you," she said softly. "I knew something was wrong." He turned to her, eyes wet with disbelief and exhaustion. "It's over." But when he looked back into the grave, he knew it wasn't. The heat rising from below was stronger now, pulsing in slow rhythm. Something shimmered in the dark, pale light, faint but growing. The air around it seemed alive. Ranger crouched low, tail between his legs, growling deep in his throat. The wind shifted, carrying a sound with it, something between a breath and a whisper. Robert leaned closer, staring into the dark hollow that had once been his son's resting place. The light flickered again, and for a fleeting moment, he saw the shape of a hand pressing up through the shifting soil. He stumbled backward, heart hammering, unable to tell if what he'd seen was real or just the reflection of grief too deep to bear. Above him, the snow kept falling, slow and endless. The grave pulsed once more. Then it went still. But Robert knew. Whatever was buried beneath the frozen earth wasn't finished with them yet. By dawn, the storm had passed. The sky above Pinecrest Cemetery was a dull silver, the kind of pale morning that follows a long night of ghosts. The snow had stopped falling, but the world still seemed hushed, wrapped in that fragile silence that comes only after great violence. The old graves glimmered beneath a thin frost, the air sharp with the scent of pine and gunpowder. Robert Hayes stood beside the collapsed grave, his body stiff from the cold and exhaustion. The revolver his mother had used lay in the snow, half buried. Dr. Lewis Crane was kneeling nearby, his detector still flickering faintly green, a soft pulse of life beneath the earth. Tom Weaver sat a few feet away, his back against a tree, hands trembling as he stared blankly at the snow. None of them spoke for a long while. Ranger was the only one who seemed certain. The German shepherd stood at the edge of the grave, ears forward, tail low, his breath forming small clouds in the cold. Every few seconds he would glance back at Robert, then back into the pit, as though urging him to see something invisible. Robert's mind was a fog of fatigue and disbelief. The night's chaos, Brooks's confession, his mother's shot, the pulsing light beneath the earth, felt like fragments of a fever dream. Yet the warmth that still rose from Ethan's grave was real. He could feel it in his bones. Mary Hayes stood a short distance away, her wool coat heavy with frost. Her gray hair was wild, her face pale but calm. She had been quiet since the shooting, her revolver tucked away inside her coat. "The sun's coming up," she said softly, looking toward the horizon. "Your father used to say dawn forgives everything." Robert looked at her. The lines on her face seemed deeper now, but there was peace there too, something unburdened. He wanted to tell her she had saved him, that she'd saved them all, but the words stuck in his throat. Dr. Crane broke the silence. "Chief Hayes," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "The signal, it's stabilizing." Robert turned. "What does that mean?" Crane adjusted the device, frowning at the readings. "Whatever's down there, it's not dying. It's changing." The earth gave a faint shiver, like an exhale. Then the light appeared again, faint, pale blue, glowing softly beneath the thin crust of snow. It wasn't threatening anymore. It was warm, gentle. It spread outward in a slow ripple, illuminating the surrounding graves like candlelight. Ranger whimpered softly and sat, his tail brushing the snow. Robert knelt beside him, his breath catching in his chest. The glow pulsed in rhythm, slow, steady, like a heartbeat. And then he heard it. A voice, not loud, not even clear, but familiar, like an echo from memory. "Dad?" His heart stopped. He looked around wildly, but the others hadn't moved. Mary's eyes widened as she, too, seemed to hear it. "Dad, don't be afraid." The light grew brighter, surrounding the grave in a halo of gold and silver. The snow melted away in a perfect circle, revealing dark earth beneath. And there, just for an instant, a hand, small, pale, familiar, pressed gently up from the soil before fading like mist in sunlight. Tears blurred Robert's vision. He sank to his knees, gripping the cold ground. "Ethan," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, son. I didn't protect you." The light shimmered again, and a new warmth spread through the air, brushing his face like a summer breeze. The voice came once more, clear this time, filled with peace. "You did, Dad. You always did." Then, slowly, the light began to sink, fading back into the earth until the grave was dark and still once more. The snow glistened where it had melted, the steam curling upward into the pale morning sky. Dr. Crane's detector went still, the screen dark. He exhaled shakily. "It's gone," he whispered. "No," Robert said, rising to his feet. His voice was quiet, certain. "It's home." The three of them stood in silence as the first light of dawn touched the treetops. The snow glowed soft pink, and for the first time in years, Robert felt warmth, not from the earth, but from within himself. He turned toward his mother. She smiled faintly, her hand brushing his arm. "He's at peace now," she said. "And so are you." Robert nodded, unable to speak. Ranger pressed against his leg, whining softly. Robert knelt, burying his hands in the dog's thick fur. "You found him," he murmured. "You never gave up." Ranger licked his hand, tail thumping once against the snow. By afternoon, the authorities had arrived. The bodies of Brooks's men were taken away, their weapons confiscated. Reporters flooded Pinecrest by evening, turning the cemetery into a field of flashing cameras. But Robert said little. He gave one statement, to the truth, not to the spectacle. Sheriff Alan Brooks had been running an underground trafficking network using the abandoned mine system beneath the town. His death and the recovery of evidence from his car brought the operation to light. The people of Pinecrest, once indifferent, now looked at Robert Hayes with reverence and guilt. The man they had called delusional had been right all along. In the weeks that followed, snow began to melt early that year. The ground thawed sooner than expected, and Pinecrest seemed to breathe again. Robert rebuilt his life quietly. He repaired his son's old camera, restored the lens, and placed it beside Ethan's framed photograph on the mantel. The cabin that once echoed with silence now carried the soft rhythm of Ranger's paws and the kettle's whistle in the mornings. Mary moved in with him, her health stronger than anyone expected. She spent her afternoons in the garden, humming softly, claiming she could still feel warmth under the soil where Ethan's grave had been. "He's part of the earth now," she'd say, "and the earth remembers." Dr. Crane stayed in touch, visiting every few weeks. His report on the Pinecrest anomaly became a small legend among his peers, a phenomenon of unknown origin, an organic luminescence beneath permafrost. But privately, he told Robert the truth. He believed what they saw that night wasn't geological at all. It was love, pure energy, unbound by death. Spring arrived in Pinecrest. The cemetery thawed, and where Ethan's grave once stood, yellow daisies bloomed, vivid and alive, growing even through frost. Robert visited each morning, no longer in grief but in quiet gratitude. One morning, as he knelt among the flowers, Ranger barked suddenly, 3 sharp barks, then one softer, almost playful. Robert turned, half smiling. "What is it, boy?" The dog was staring toward the tree line. There, in the gentle haze of morning light, stood a figure, a young man, tall, shoulders broad, familiar. He didn't move, didn't speak, just smiled, faint and peaceful. The light caught his hair, the same chestnut brown as Robert's, and then, as the wind shifted, he was gone. Robert stood there for a long moment, the air still around him. He looked down at Ranger, who wagged his tail once, softly, as if confirming what Robert already knew. "Yeah," Robert whispered. "I saw him too." The man and his dog stood in silence, the snow melting beneath their boots. The mountains in the distance gleamed white against the morning sun. For the first time in years, Robert Hayes allowed himself to smile. He turned toward the gate, the path ahead bright and open. Ranger walked beside him, head high, eyes calm. The world at last felt lighter. Behind them, the daisies swayed gently in the wind, golden petals catching the sunlight. And beneath the thawing earth, something glowed once more, not haunting, not restless, but serene. The light beneath the snow was not a warning, not a curse. It was love refusing to die. When the last light faded from Pinecrest and the snow began to melt, Robert Hayes finally understood. Miracles don't always arrive in thunder or angels' wings. Sometimes they whisper through the wind, through a dog that refuses to leave, through a mother's unshakable love, and through the faint warmth rising from the earth where grief once lived. What happened beneath the snow wasn't horror, it was grace. It was God's quiet reminder that love does not end in the grave. It transforms. Just as winter yields to spring, pain yields to faith. Ethan's light wasn't lost, it was returned to the Father's hands. Each of us carries a buried sorrow, a loss, a wound, a silence. But if we listen, if we keep faith like Robert and Ranger did, we may feel that same warmth rise again. The miracle of a love that outlasts death, the proof that heaven is never far from those who believe. Let this story remind us, even under the coldest snow, God's hand is still at work, weaving resurrection from ruin, turning tears into testimony. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what miracle you still believe in. Subscribe for more stories that restore faith in second chances and God's quiet grace. And may the Lord bless every soul watching. May He heal your grief, warm your winters, and remind you, nothing buried in love ever truly dies.